A pair of black twins was asked to vacate their first-class seats to make room for a self-proclaimed frequent flyer, a white passenger who insisted on their seats. The seats had been legally booked as a gift from their powerful father, but that seemed irrelevant in the face of arrogance cloaked in membership privilege. But just after one phone call, everything changed. Every mask came off. What would you do if someone tried to take away something that rightfully belonged to you simply because they believed their reputation or status gave them more rights than you? On that flight, high above the clouds, the resilient silence of the two children and the swift action from their father revealed one undeniable truth. Dignity is not up for negotiation. Justice cannot be bought, and true power always belongs to those who dare to stand up for what's right. Inside the luxurious first-class cabin of a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, Elijah and Olivia Carter, 15-year-old twins, sat quietly, their excitement mixed with a touch of nervousness as they flew for the first time without their parents by their side. They were Elijah and Olivia Carter, the proud children of Michael Carter, the renowned CEO of the global tech giant Global Tech. Since childhood, the twins had been inseparable, but this was the first time they were experiencing a special trip without their father's direct presence. Michael had personally arranged the two best VIP seats for them, 1A and 1B, as a special gift to mark their first step into maturity. Michael believed that through this journey, Elijah and Olivia would learn invaluable lessons about independence, self-respect, and how to conduct themselves in real-world situations, even when there were no adults around. As soon as they settled into their seats, Elijah gently reclined in the soft leather chair, smiling with satisfaction as he felt an unprecedented comfort. His eyes lit up with joy as he looked out the window at the fluffy white clouds drifting through the endless blue sky. Olivia sat beside him, gentle yet refined, her eyes focused on the small book their father had given them before they left. Occasionally, Olivia would look up and smile, sharing her excitement and nervousness with her brother. This wasn't just any trip. It was an important milestone on the path to adulthood that they were both heading toward. "Do you think we're ready for this trip, Elijah?" Olivia asked softly, her voice tinged with a little uncertainty. Dad already said it. Olivia. Elijah smiled reassuringly at his sister, his eyes filled with confidence. "We can totally do this. This is our chance to show him that he was right to trust us." At that moment, a flight attendant in a sleek blue uniform approached their seats, smiling gently as she asked, "Mr. and Miss Carter, would you like some refreshments before we take off?" Elijah and Olivia exchanged delighted glances at the formal way they were addressed, a courtesy they had only ever seen their father receive. Elijah answered softly, "We'll have orange juice. Thank you." As the flight attendant walked away, Olivia chuckled quietly and turned to her brother with a cheerful tone. "It looks like this trip is going to be a lot of fun. I think we'll make Dad proud." Elijah nodded with certainty, his eyes gazing out at the sky, which was gradually turning a golden orange with the early sunset. Little did they know, within minutes, this seemingly calm and meaningful journey would soon be confronted with an unexpected storm, a true test of their maturity, courage, and dignity, one they never imagined they'd face. In that moment, as Elijah lifted his glass of orange juice to his lips, and Olivia was still smiling happily at the flight attendant's kindness, neither of them noticed that the peaceful and luxurious atmosphere on the flight was about to be shattered by a powerful undercurrent about to hit. Confident footsteps echoed across the first-class cabin, A middle-aged white woman appeared in the aisle, her slim figure wrapped in an elegant beige coat, her sharp but stern face covered by carefully applied makeup. Karen Mitchell was no ordinary passenger. She was a long-time Platinum Elite customer with Skyline Airways, notorious for her difficult temper and her expectations for service far exceeding the usual standard. Karen's gaze swept quickly across the first-class cabin, her eyes evaluating as though inspecting if everything met her high expectations. But when her eyes landed on the two front seats, her preferred spots on countless previous flights, satisfaction immediately vanished from her face, her thin eyebrows furrowed in displeasure, and her lips pressed into a tight, sharp line. Not bothering to hide her displeasure, Karen took a long, haughty breath, then strode toward Elijah and Olivia. Her arrival immediately changed the atmosphere around them. It was as if an invisible chill was slowly spreading across the once comfortable, warm space. "What's going on?" Olivia whispered to Elijah, tilting her head toward the unfamiliar woman approaching them. Elijah also sensed the shift, but remained calm, shrugging lightly. Maybe she needs something. Karen stopped in front of the twins, her cold green eyes staring at them, scrutinizing them with suspicion. Her voice rang out clearly and sharply, loud enough for those around to hear. "Excuse me, but it seems there's been a mix-up. Seats 1A and 1B have been mine for years," Karen said in a chilling tone, her words carrying an air of accusation as she directed them toward the twins. A nearby flight attendant immediately approached, attempting to explain politely. "Miss Mitchell, we've checked thoroughly, and these seats are indeed reserved for Elijah and Olivia Carter." "Carter," Karen interrupted decisively, not allowing the flight attendant to finish. "That name means nothing to me. Maybe you don't know who I am. I am a long-time Platinum Elite customer. I never sit anywhere other than these two front seats." The passengers around them began glancing over, curiosity and concern mixed on their faces. Elijah remained calm while Olivia furrowed her brow at the unreasonable and arrogant behavior of this stranger. "Ma'am, perhaps you should check with the airline staff again. We are certain these are our seats," Elijah responded calmly, his tone still polite. At this, Karen's face darkened with increasing displeasure, her eyes flashing with an anger never seen before. For her, having to argue over this familiar seat with two complete strangers was a grave insult to the status she believed she deserved. "Are you telling me I need to check again?" Karen sneered sarcastically, her eyes cold enough to pierce Elijah's soul. "I don't need to check anything because this seat belongs to me. Do you know how much I've spent with this airline? I will not accept sitting anywhere else just because of two kids like you." Karen emphasized the phrase "two kids" deliberately, as if trying to wound Elijah and Olivia's dignity. The air around them quickly became tense like a taut violin string, waiting for the moment it would snap. Elijah and Olivia exchanged quick glances. They both understood that this was the first real challenge on the journey their father had mentioned. But this challenge had come much more unexpectedly and intensely than they had ever imagined. The silence between the luxurious leather seats was now replaced by a heavy atmosphere, as if the entire first-class cabin was holding its breath in response to the arrogant accusation just made. Karen's last words, "I will not accept giving up my seat for two kids like you," echoed like a silent knife cutting into the dignity of Elijah and Olivia. Elijah remained seated, his hands placed calmly on his lap, his gaze not avoiding but confronting Karen directly. Olivia tilted her head slightly, her lips pressed tight, eyes sharp as a razor, not from fear but from anger, suppressed with dignity. Karen, accustomed to giving orders and being pampered on every flight, could not accept being defied by two teenagers, especially black ones. Her frustration wasn't just about the seat. It was about the disruption of the unspoken order she had always assumed. People like her were above, and others should know their place. Listen here. She raised her chin towards Elijah with a look of disdain, her voice no longer restrained. You can sit anywhere. There's a whole row behind you. You still get to fly first class, but I'm not sitting anywhere other than 1A. This has been my seat since 2017. I won't accept this change just because someone has a little money and a name no one knows. Her last words were emphasized clearly, as if intentionally stirring up discrimination based on age, skin color, and social status. Karen's face at that moment was carved in stone, her lower jaw pushed out, her eyes wide and cold, her lips drawn tight in contempt. A few passengers began to turn their heads, pretending to adjust their jackets or search through their bags, but clearly watching the situation unfold. No one spoke. They just observed silently as though this were a high-stakes drama being performed mid-air. "Ma'am," Elijah responded slowly, not hiding his restraint. "I understand this seat may bring you many memories or a sense of familiarity, but we're not taking your seat. This seat was legally reserved by my father, and we have the right to sit here." Karen's eyes narrowed as if that polite reply was an immense insult. She turned abruptly to the flight attendant, ordering, "You get the flight supervisor here right now. I'm not talking to children. And if you don't want to lose your most loyal customer, then do the right thing. Put me in my rightful seat." The flight attendant, who had been trying to remain neutral, began to show signs of discomfort. In all the thousands of flights she had served, she had never encountered a situation like this. A customer outright rejecting the legitimate rights of others and loudly demanding the airline staff to treat her as though it were her private property. Olivia leaned slightly towards her brother, whispering just loud enough for Elijah to hear. "I don't think she's going to stop." Elijah simply nodded, his eyes still fixed on Karen. Karen's voice continued, this time louder and clearer, as if deliberately making sure the entire first class could hear. "This is the problem when people start selling first-class tickets to anyone with a gold credit card and some ambition." Each word she spoke was filled with malice, openly revealing her discrimination and disdain. This was no longer simply a debate over a seat. It was an attack on their dignity, on their right to exist as equals in the same space. Some of the gazes from the rows behind began to shift. Some frowned. Some sighed, but no one intervened. The atmosphere was stifling, as taut as a violin string, and any word spoken now could make it snap. Meanwhile, Karen still stood there, hands on her hips, her eyes scanning the cabin like a queen, waiting for her subordinates to kneel. Elijah, after a moment of silence, turned slowly toward her, responding with calm assurance. "Ma'am, I don't know who you think you are, but I know who I am. I am the son of Michael Carter, and I'm sitting in my rightful seat." Ticketed. Confirmed. If you want to sit here, I'm afraid you'll have to wait for the next flight. And with those words, the 15-year-old boy, with an astonishing calm, had pushed Karen Mitchell into a battle she no longer had the upper hand in. She didn't realize that this time her opponent wasn't a group of passengers who would bow their heads to avoid trouble, but two children raised on understanding, self-respect, and a foundation of strength she could never have predicted. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had not yet calmed after Elijah's calm but sharp retort, when Karen Mitchell quickly lost the last bit of restraint she had left. The heavy air now seemed to compress, thickening and suffocating, as her mocking laughter rang out dry and sharp through her clenched teeth. "Ah, so that's how it is," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Another one of those rich kids using the Carter name to squeeze into a place where kids like you don't belong." Elijah remained still, his hands resting on his thighs, his shoulders not trembling. But in his eyes, the gentle light from before had been replaced by a deep, steadfast resolve, a clear awareness of what was happening. He understood that this was no longer about a seat. It was a confrontation between arrogance and dignity, between blind privilege and unshakable self-respect. Olivia, who had stayed silent since Karen raised her voice, was not timid. She stood tall, her hands lightly resting on the armrests, her eyes piercing into Karen like a velvet-tipped arrow. She didn't need to respond with words. It was her calm composure that made the other woman uncomfortable to the point of madness. Karen, realizing that she couldn't sway them with pressure or her self-imposed title, began to descend further into insult. Her voice grew louder, more irritable, intentionally projecting for the entire cabin to hear. "You kids don't know anything about sitting here. This isn't school. This is first class on an international airline. This place is for adults, for people who've earned money and have a position in society, not for pampered little brats." A few passengers glanced up, confused. A man with headphones removed one side, casting a look at the situation. An older woman sitting nearby turned her face away, clearly wanting to avoid getting involved. But no one spoke. No one defended them. No one intervened. They chose silence. A silence that made the ones enduring it feel lonelier than any harsh words could. Elijah quietly leaned his head toward Olivia. She still stood tall, her eyes never leaving Karen. In that moment, they didn't need to say anything to each other. They understood each other too well. The bond of twins in their blood, their minds, and their hearts had never been stronger. A slow, controlled anger rose within Elijah's chest, but it was perfectly contained by the calm exterior he had learned from his father. He took a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice was still soft but as sharp as a finely honed blade. "Ma'am, we're not here to be given permission. We're here because we have tickets. Tickets booked by my father. And if you want to argue about it, you'll need to talk to the airline, not insult people who have done nothing wrong." Karen squinted, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You're lecturing me?" she nearly hissed. "I've flown first class before you were born, kid. I've stepped foot in over 30 countries, spent hundreds of thousands on this airline. I don't care who your father is. To me, you two are just pampered little children sitting in the wrong seat." Her words made Olivia furrow her brow slightly. Quietly, she took half a step forward, her voice as light as a breath but clear and loud in the stillness, between the verbal clash. "We may be kids, but at least we know how to treat others like human beings." Karen paused for a moment. The subtle yet sharp retort from the young girl seemed to strike a nerve. In her mind, the challenge coming from two black children, something she had never imagined she'd have to endure, had insulted her arrogance to its very core. She turned to the flight attendant, who had just returned after calling the flight supervisor. Karen's voice was now as cold as a knife. "What are you still standing there for? I demand you move these kids to the back seats. Are you really going to let your most loyal customer stand in the aisle while these children stay comfortably in my seat?" The flight attendant, named Megan, swallowed nervously. This young woman had only been transferred to first class 3 months ago. It was the first time she had witnessed a platinum member lose their temper, and it was entirely outside the scope of her theoretical training. "Ma'am," Megan tried to regain her composure. "I've checked. These 2 seats really belong to Elijah and Olivia Carter. The system confirms it. Then just switch it." Karen cut her off. "I don't care what system it is. I'm Karen Mitchell. I sit in 1A. Do you understand?" Megan took half a step back, her eyes starting to well up. Under Karen's pressure, the young woman felt herself pushed to the limit. But before she could say anything more, a calm, authoritative voice rang out from the front of the cabin. "What's going on here?" Everyone turned. A middle-aged woman with a bright face, neatly pinned blonde hair, and a dark uniform with flight supervisor insignia stepped forward. She was Laura Evans, a woman with nearly 2 decades of experience handling in-flight incidents, known for her calm demeanor but extremely practical approach. Karen immediately walked over to her as if finding an ally, and her voice turned soft but calculating. "Laura, thank God. I need you to help handle this ridiculous situation. My seat, 1A and 1B, has been taken by these kids. I don't know what the airline is thinking anymore." Laura looked at Elijah and Olivia. Her eyes briefly widened with surprise as she saw the 2 children still sitting quietly, not shouting, not reacting like children. Elijah nodded a greeting. Olivia gave a polite smile. She turned back to Karen. "I'll check the tickets and verify immediately, Miss Mitchell." But deep in Laura's eyes, something shifted. She began to realize this confrontation wasn't just about a seat. And if she didn't handle it carefully, it was going to become a storm. And in the heart of that storm, the children she had once looked down on were now the ones standing on the side of truth. Laura Evans squinted as she held the tablet in her hands and scrolled through the booking information. Her eyes moved from the clearly displayed names Elijah Carter, seat 1A, and Olivia Carter, seat 1B, before slowly glancing over at the 2 children sitting directly in front of her. Their youthful faces were calm, but in their eyes was something Laura was not accustomed to seeing in young passengers, an understanding of their rights, an unbargainable self-respect, and a resilience that should not have been present in 15-year-olds. However, Laura did not mention the seat confirmation. Instead, she lowered the tablet, turned her gaze to Karen Mitchell, then back to Elijah and Olivia, her voice steady but laden with implication. "You know, sometimes in situations like this, we need to be a little flexible, especially when a long-time passenger like Mrs. Mitchell is dissatisfied, and that can affect the entire flight." Elijah tilted his head slightly, a gesture of politeness, but one that couldn't hide his surprise. He immediately understood that the flight supervisor was not siding with the truth but choosing the easier path, sacrificing their clear rights to satisfy a valuable customer. Olivia remained silent, but her expression shifted. It was no longer gentle. Now her gaze was cold, staring directly into the moral void unfolding between the words and actions of the woman in front of them. "Excuse me, Mrs. Evans," Olivia spoke, her voice soft but clear enough that no one could ignore it. "We cannot be flexible with something we rightfully own. This seat was legally booked by our father. This is not a matter of emotion." In the cabin, the space seemed to freeze. Olivia's words, clear, logical, and completely non-offensive, only made Karen angrier than ever. "Listen to that! She's teaching the airline staff!" Karen screamed, almost losing her composure as a lady. "Do you see this? These kids are causing a scene, refusing to cooperate. I'm platinum elite. I deserve priority." As if to add weight to her words, Karen turned to the back where a few passengers were watching the incident, pointing towards the children and shouting, "If anyone can just come up here and sit wherever they want, what's the point of this system anymore? We have rules for those who sit in the wrong seat, but no rules for kids with money doing whatever they want." Her words didn't just hit Elijah and Olivia. They also struck at the integrity of the flight crew, at the professional ethics that Laura Evans had been trained in for nearly 2 decades. But sadly, instead of standing for justice, she chose safety. Or at least she thought she did. Jack. Laura turned to call her colleague, Jack Harris, the tall flight attendant with a stoic face who had just appeared from the back cabin. "Can you check if there are any other appropriate seats available for these young guests? We can't delay takeoff for too long." Elijah raised his head and looked straight into Jack's eyes, but the man looked away. He simply said, "I'll check the back. There are a few seats available in first class." Olivia turned to her brother, her voice shaking for the first time, not out of fear, but out of fury. "You hear that? They're really pushing us out." Elijah placed his hand on his sister's. A light touch meant to reassure her. He turned back to look at Laura and Jack and said in a voice that wasn't loud, but made everyone around them take notice, "I'm not trying to make things difficult for anyone here, but I won't accept being treated like an outsider. This is my seat and my sister's. We are not wrong. If this flight is delayed because of this, it's not our fault. It's because someone thinks their status gives them the right to infringe upon someone else's rights." Those words made both Laura and Jack pause. Karen was about to retort, but her voice was interrupted by a middle-aged male passenger from the back. "I've been flying with Skyline for over 10 years, and I know how seats are booked. If they have tickets, they have the right." "Mrs. Mitchell, I think you should sit in your proper seat." Karen spun around, her eyes red with anger, but no one spoke in her defense again. Laura's gaze moved to Megan, the young flight attendant, who had been quietly witnessing everything from the beginning, holding the printed passenger list in her hands. Despite her limited experience, Megan still held on to her integrity until the very end. She stepped forward, handing the list to Laura, her voice firm. "Elijah and Olivia Carter, seats 1A and 1B, confirmed by the system and payment confirmation signed. No mistakes." Laura took the list, silent. There was a momentary flicker of embarrassment in her eyes, but instead of acknowledging the mistake, she simply said quietly, "I understand." Yet, Karen didn't let up. She continued to apply pressure, stepping closer to the 2 children, lowering her voice but filled with spite. "You think you've won? This isn't over. I'll be calling the CEO's office, and I'm sure someone will be held responsible for this humiliation." Neither Elijah nor Olivia responded. They simply looked at Karen with calm expressions that made the woman choke on her own words. Her threats, her prideful titles, and her empty threats suddenly seemed hollow in the face of one truth. For the first time in hundreds of flights, she couldn't use her status to make someone bow their head. Karen Mitchell, who had always appeared as a symbol of power in the skies, now felt isolated for the first time. And that was just the beginning. The lingering, bitter glare from Karen Mitchell still clawed at their backs like an invisible talon, even as Elijah and Olivia gently rose from their seats. No one spoke. No one touched them, but the suffocating silence that enveloped the first-class cabin made every step they took feel like walking on the verge of breaking glass. Elijah placed his hand on his sister's back in a protective gesture. No words needed. Olivia walked close beside him, her head held high, indifferent to the eyes quietly following their every move. They didn't give up. They simply withdrew for a moment. Like two warriors knowing that to win sometimes you must step back and choose a stronger weapon, the truth and real support. Reaching the back of the first-class cabin where a thick green curtain separated them from the rest, Elijah gently pushed it aside and signaled to a young flight attendant standing nearby. The girl, still clearly young with a hint of concern on her face, nodded quietly as she saw the expression on his face. Without needing further explanation, Elijah's eyes were enough to convey that he didn't want to be overheard. She immediately stepped back toward the storage area, creating a private space without asking any more questions. Elijah pulled out his phone from his coat pocket. His hand trembled slightly, not out of fear, but from the pent-up frustration and anger that had yet to be released. Olivia's hand lightly touched his, not needing to say a word. Her presence was all the reassurance he needed. The screen lit up. Elijah dialed the familiar number, a series of digits he had only used when he truly needed a kind of strength stronger than anything else in the world. His father. Before the third ring, a deep, warm voice answered decisively. From the other end, Michael Carter. Hearing his father's voice, Elijah's chest relaxed for a brief moment, but he still forced himself to maintain a calm tone, lowering the volume just enough so Olivia could hear beside him. "Dad, it's me, Elijah. Olivia and I are on the flight to San Francisco. There's a problem." Michael Carter didn't waste time with unnecessary questions. He was the type of person who, when hearing a change in his child's tone, knew something was wrong. "Stay calm and tell me. Is anyone hurt?" "No. No one's hurt." But Elijah hesitated, taking a deep breath, then explained more clearly. "A female passenger named Karen Mitchell is demanding that Olivia and I be kicked out of the VIP seats, 1A and 1B. She says those seats have always been hers and refuses to accept our presence." Elijah paused for a moment, then continued, this time slowly but firmly. "The flight supervisor and one attendant are also leaning in her favor. They're telling us to be flexible so the flight doesn't get delayed. But these are our seats, Dad. You booked them. They know that, but they're still putting pressure on us." There was a long pause on the other end. Elijah and Olivia could clearly imagine their father, one of the most powerful figures in the tech industry, sitting in his office, his hand gently gripping a pen, his gaze slowly growing more intense with each word. Finally, Michael spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but there was a power in it that made Elijah feel grounded in the face of all the injustice surrounding them. "You did nothing wrong. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise. Those seats are yours. You have the ticket, the confirmation, the right. Where are you, Dad?" Olivia spoke up for the first time, her voice quiet but resolute. "I'm at the office, but soon everyone on that plane will know that." Michael paused for a moment, then spoke with the tone both Elijah and Olivia had heard hundreds of times in high-stakes negotiations. "I'm handling this now. You two go back to your seats. Hold your heads high. Don't step back, not even 1 inch." Elijah felt as though a surge of strength had been injected straight into his spine. He nodded, even though his father couldn't see him, and whispered, "Thanks, Dad. No need to thank me. It's what I have to do." The call ended, and the space around them suddenly became still again. Olivia looked at Elijah, her eyes shining with a quiet strength. "I believe he'll make them regret it." Elijah smiled faintly, not with anger, but with justice. The two siblings walked back through the curtain. When they returned to their seats, Karen was still standing there, her arms crossed in front of her chest, her face as cold as marble. She watched them with a skeptical glare, as if unable to believe that the children could do anything other than retreat. But she didn't know. In those few short minutes, a wave of power had begun moving from a skyscraper in New York, and it was headed straight for that Boeing 787 at a speed no one could stop. At the top floor of the Global Tech headquarters, a tense atmosphere filled the main conference room. The attendees, consisting of senior executives of the corporation and representatives from an international investment fund, were focused on a presentation of a $1.2 billion partnership proposal with a leading semiconductor manufacturer from Japan. But at the head of the table, Michael Carter had lost his concentration. His eyes were fixed on the phone, sitting on the table, his hands clasped together, his fingers tapping lightly as if his mind were preparing to issue a command. Elijah and Olivia had returned to their seats, trying to maintain composure. But Michael, always the man of calm and strategy, had heard something he could not ignore. His children's legitimate rights being violated by an arrogant woman with the complicity of the airline's own staff. No further explanation was needed. He stood up, cutting off the speaker with a simple but firm raise of his hand. "Excuse me, everyone? I need to leave the meeting. Family matter. Very serious." No one asked any further questions. When Michael Carter spoke, people understood that any delay was pointless. He left the room with long, confident strides, leaving behind looks of concern that no one dared to challenge. As soon as the door to his private office closed, Michael picked up the internal phone, dialing a familiar 3-digit number. The voice of his executive assistant answered almost immediately. "Yes, Mr. Carter. Put me through to James Callahan immediately. James Callahan, the CEO of Skyline Airways, Global Tech's senior airline partner for 7 years. The man who had toasted with Michael at the Davos Economic Forum, and the one who had promised that Global Tech customers will always be treated with the utmost dignity." A few seconds later, the line connected. A deep, growly voice responded politely. "Michael, I didn't expect to hear from you right now. How can I help?" Michael wasted no time. "My son and daughter, Elijah and Olivia, are on Skyline Flight 473 to San Francisco, first class, seats 1A and 1B. These seats were legally reserved over 2 weeks ago with full confirmation details. But right now, a passenger named Karen Mitchell is pressuring my children to give up their seats. And worse, the flight crew, including the flight supervisor and the stewardess, are not protecting their rights. Instead, they are trying to push them out of their seats to please a VIP customer." James was silent for a few seconds, not out of surprise. He had dealt with internal issues before, but this was the first time it had directly involved the children of one of the most powerful people in the American tech industry. Michael continued, his voice lowering, but each word coming out like steel. I don't need an apology. I need action immediately. If your airline treats black children, no matter who they are, like this, then we have a deeper issue than just a flight. James immediately responded, his voice now full of tension. Michael, I completely understand. I'm sorry this happened. I'll handle it personally. I will send 2 senior representatives directly to the plane to assess the situation. If there are any violations, they'll handle it on the spot. I'll be waiting for news in 10 minutes, Michael replied, then hung up without another word. He didn't need reassurances. He needed the truth to be exposed on that plane right away. On Flight 473, the Boeing 787 was still preparing for takeoff, but instead of the roar of the engine starting up, the first-class cabin was filled with a suffocating tension. Karen Mitchell, with a victorious smile, stood with her arms crossed next to the flight supervisor, Laura Evans. Even though Elijah and Olivia had returned to their seats, she hadn't given up. Her gaze shot over at Elijah's phone as he slipped it back into his pocket. Clearly, she was trying to figure out who he had just called. Laura and Jack Harris were standing near the cabin door when the sound of rapid, decisive footsteps echoed down the aisle. The airplane door opened again, a rare occurrence so close to departure. 2 men in black suits wearing senior employee badges from Skyline walked in with serious expressions. One, graying, wore the name tag Robert Evans, while the other was younger with sharp eyes named Matthew Hughes. Robert moved straight toward the flight supervisor. I'm Robert Evans. This is Matthew Hughes. We're here on direct orders from Chairman James Callahan. We need to know immediately why a legally reserved VIP seat is not being protected. Laura froze. Her eyes flickered between Karen and Elijah and Olivia. The atmosphere was so heavy that it felt like every sound around them had disappeared. Karen stepped forward, forcing a smile. I'm a Platinum Elite customer. I always sit in 1A. Perhaps there's been a minor mistake today. I just asked for those children to move because of tradition. Robert interrupted her, his voice as hard as stone. Tradition does not replace a contract. Children are passengers, too. And if you think that skin color or age gives you the right to deny someone their fully paid seat, then you're very mistaken. Karen's eyes widened and her breath caught. Robert turned to Laura. Miss Evans, why didn't you protect the rights of the passengers? Laura stammered. I was trying to make sure the flight took off on time. I thought if the 2 kids moved, everything would be quiet, right? Matthew Hughes chimed in. But quieting things by pushing innocent people out of their rightful seats is not how Skyline operates. The atmosphere froze. Elijah looked over at Olivia. She bit her lip, her eyes slightly misted, not from weakness, but from the emotions that had been held back, now finally finding an outlet. Karen Mitchell had no more words. Her smile vanished, replaced by a pale face, as if for the first time in her life she had lost control of the outcome, and that was just the beginning. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was like a thin, taut sheet of glass, just waiting for a light touch to shatter it. And it was Robert Evans' cold, cutting voice, the senior representative of Skyline Airways, that became the final force to act. Karen Mitchell still stood there, no longer the confident platinum elite woman strutting into the cabin. Instead, before her now were people whose power no longer lay in membership cards or frequent flyer miles, but in decisions and consequences. And she was at the center of a decision about to be made. Just minutes after the conversation with Laura Evans, the VIP cabin door opened once again, the second time on the same flight, something that had never happened in the history of normal operations. All the passengers turned their heads, and this time the two men entering the cabin didn't look like flight crew or technical attendants. They carried the air of decision-makers, not enforcers. Both were dressed in dark suits, ties neatly fastened, shoes polished like mirrors, employee badges firmly attached to their left lapels. But you didn't need to see their names. One could feel the power they carried. It was Richard Bennett, the regional director of Skyline Airways, and Stephen Coleman, head of internal affairs. If Robert Evans represented the serious voice of the leadership, Richard Bennett was the one who made the final decisions on the ground, and he did not like to be bothered by issues that should have been handled at a lower level. When Richard and Stephen entered, no one spoke. The entire first-class cabin, passengers and crew alike, seemed to collectively hold its breath. The only sounds were the faint rustling of papers in Richard's hand and Stephen's calculating gaze sweeping over each person. Elijah, Olivia, Karen, Laura, and then landing on Jack Harris. Richard stopped in front of Flight Supervisor Laura Evans. His voice was low, but it resonated like a bell striking a stone wall. "Miss Evans, I want to hear it from your mouth. Why are two young passengers with valid tickets and confirmed reservations being asked to vacate their seats?" Laura opened her mouth, but the words barely came out. I was just trying to coordinate to make sure the flight wouldn't be delayed. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Mitchell is a platinum customer. She said that seats 1A and 1B are usually hers. "I'm not asking what Mrs. Mitchell said," Richard interrupted, his voice suddenly as cold as ice. "I'm asking why you didn't protect the passengers sitting in their rightful, fully paid seats." Seats confirmed by the system, the booking agent, and the final list. Laura fell silent. Stephen Coleman stepped beside Richard, pulling out a printed passenger data sheet from the black briefcase he was carrying. He raised it high for everyone to see. Elijah Carter, seat 1A. Olivia Carter, seat 1B. Booked on the 2nd of this month. Payment confirmed through the banking system. No transfers, no mistakes, no system errors. Jack Harris, who had been standing behind Laura, finally spoke, his voice trembling. I was just following the supervisor's instructions. I didn't force them to move." Richard turned to look at him, his eyes narrowing. "You're a flight attendant. Your job isn't to pamper VIP customers. Your job is to ensure that every passenger, everyone, is treated fairly. When a passenger, especially a child, is humiliated, you choose to stay silent." Jack remains silent, swallowing hard. Elijah and Olivia stood behind their seats, eyes forward, not appearing victorious but not faltering either. Richard slowly walked up to the two siblings. When he spoke, his voice lowered, but each word was clear. "Elijah, Olivia, on behalf of Skyline Airways, I apologize for the experience you've had to endure. Our company has a responsibility to protect the dignity and rights of all passengers, regardless of age, gender, or skin color. This," he turned to look at Laura and Jack, "should never have happened." Karen Mitchell stood nearby, her face pale, but even so, Her pride still made her speak weakly, but threateningly. "I will speak to the executive board. I have connections on the board. You are making a huge mistake treating me this way." Richard turned to face her, the first time since he stepped onto the plane. His gaze wasn't hostile, but it carried a kind of power that made the person facing him instinctively take a step back. No one, not even you, has the right to take away the dignity of another passenger, especially when that behavior is accompanied by blatant discrimination. Skyline does not serve privilege if that privilege tramples on fairness. Stephen Coleman stepped forward, slowly pulling out a sealed envelope. "Mrs. Karen Mitchell," he declared clearly, "by the authority of the Director of Passenger Behavior Control, I hereby announce your Platinum Elite membership is permanently revoked, effective today." The reason: a severe violation of passenger ethics, misconduct, and defamation of another's dignity in a public space. Karen staggered back a step. No one spoke, but the entire VIP cabin seemed to vibrate with the aftershocks of that decision. Elijah quietly turned to Olivia. She remained silent, her hands clenched. But in her eyes there was a fierce light. Not because of Karen Mitchell's punishment, but because justice had finally entered the cabin in the form of people who did not bow to what was called tradition. The flight had not yet taken off, but for Elijah and Olivia, they had already weathered the first storm with one thing alone: truth and unwavering resolve. Karen Mitchell stood frozen as she heard Stephen Coleman's declaration revoking her Platinum Elite status. What she had always considered her protective charm, the thing that allowed her to hold her head high and demand whatever she wanted on every flight, was now stripped away before the eyes of all the passengers like a sentence that didn't require a gavel. But that wasn't the end. As the atmosphere in the cabin had not yet returned to normal, Richard Bennett turned to Laura Evans and Jack Harris, his gaze no longer filled with disappointment, but judgment. He didn't need any more reports or excuses, for the truth had already played out before him with plenty of witnesses. His voice rang out clearly, each word hitting like a hammer against stone. "I am officially suspending the duties of Flight Supervisor Laura Evans and Attendant Jack Harris for serious violations of professional ethics, favoritism toward a passenger, and failing to protect the rightful rights of those sitting in their legally confirmed seats." Whispers erupted all around. Passengers who had been silent now began to show their emotions. Some were surprised, some nodded in agreement, and some smiled with relief, as if someone had finally said what everyone had been thinking. Laura stood stunned, her face pale, as if she had just been punched in the stomach. She blinked rapidly, trying to swallow down the rising panic. "Mr. Bennett, please wait," her voice faltered. "I was just trying to handle the situation. I only wanted to keep the flight running smoothly. I didn't mean to discriminate." Richard raised his hand, decisive. "You stood silent when a passenger was humiliated for their age and skin color. You knew that seat had been confirmed, but still pressured them to be flexible. That's not handling a situation. That's ignoring the principles." Jack Harris, standing beside Laura, clenched his lips as if to protest, but all he could say was one short sentence. "I was just following the supervisor's instructions." Stephen Coleman immediately retorted, his gaze as sharp as a blade. "You are the one directly serving the passengers. You stayed silent while a teenager was humiliated in the VIP cabin. You stood there doing nothing. To us, that's not passivity, it's complicity. At that moment, Karen Mitchell lifted her head, her eyes darting around as if searching for someone to cling to. But there was no one. The faces around her, the crowd she had once manipulated into silence, now looked at her with a very different gaze, cold, observant, and judgmental. Then, like the first crack in a proud statue, her lips began to tremble. Are you doing this because of those kids? Because they're black? Because they have a billionaire father? And what about me? I'm a loyal customer. I've brought in hundreds of thousands for this airline. No one responded. Quickly, 2 airport security officers in gray uniforms appeared at the front of the cabin, stepping forward with an air of authority that needed no introduction. They stopped next to Laura and Jack. No hands needed, no force required, just their gaze and a clear command. Ms. Evans and Mr. Harris, please gather your personal belongings. By directive from the executive board, you are to be suspended immediately. We will escort you off the plane for internal investigation. Laura turned to Jack. He looked back at her. No one spoke. They both knew that from this moment the aviation careers they had built over the years could be over. As Laura quietly took off her supervisor badge, her hands trembling, she glanced at Karen, a look of hope, as if expecting at least some acknowledgement of sympathy. But Karen only lowered her head, not out of regret, but because the shame had finally reached her. The passengers silently watched as Laura and Jack left the cabin. No one saw them off. No one felt regret. Only silence. Silence that was no longer out of fear or caution, but a cleansing after justice had spoken. When the door closed behind them, the first-class cabin seemed to brighten just a little. At the front row, Elijah and Olivia sat still. No joy, no gloating, but inside they felt a peace, as if someone had finally restored the justice that should have been there from the beginning. Olivia gently leaned towards her brother, whispering, "I never thought justice could step onto a plane and stand in front of everyone like that." Elijah smiled faintly, his gaze deep, looking out the window where the runway lights began to flicker on, signaling that the flight was about to depart. Dad always said, "If we stand firm for what's right, sooner or later the world has to change." From a distance, Karen Mitchell still hadn't sat down. Even though Laura and Jack had left the plane, she remained standing, her eyes lost. Her status was gone. Her control had collapsed, and now before her was a naked truth she had spent her life avoiding. Privilege cannot buy back the dignity that has been lost. The airplane cabin door had just closed behind Laura and Jack less than a minute ago. But to Karen Mitchell, it felt like a death nail for the privileged world she had relied on for so long. She stood frozen like a stone pillar amid the flood, her eyes vacant, but her hands beginning to shake with the anger that had been suppressed for far too long. From a familiar figure in the VIP section, always served wine before ordering food, Karen was now stripped of her privileges, isolated and surrounded by silence from every direction. No one spoke to her. No one looked at her with sympathy. And it was that silence that made her explode. Suddenly, Karen shoved aside a passing flight attendant, stepping into the aisle with a shrill, metallic voice that pierced through the cabin air. "I want to speak to the captain right now." The sound ripped through the air, startling a few passengers who turned their heads while others frowned in irritation. But Karen didn't stop. She stood there, chin held high, eyes wide open as if trying to assert her power with one final collision. No one has the right to take my seat. No one is allowed to silence me. I've flown with this airline for over a decade, and I deserve an explanation from the captain. I won't let 2 kids and a bunch of ungrateful staff humiliate me like this." Her voice reverberated through the cabin, no longer the tone of a refined woman. Now Karen Mitchell was nothing but a shadow of power, screaming in desperation, because for the first time, she couldn't control the outcome. One of the new flight attendants recently assigned stepped forward, trying to remain calm. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat so we can prepare for takeoff. Meeting with the captain will not be allowed unless there is a serious safety concern. Is insulting a loyal passenger not a serious enough reason?" Karen screeched. "Call him out here! If I don't speak with the captain, this flight will not take off." A silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, the cockpit door opened. A tall man stepped out from inside around his 50s, walking with the measured gait of a military officer, his dark blue uniform perfectly pressed, and his captain's hat removed with his left hand as he entered the cabin. His face was stern, eyes sharp like the blade of someone who had handled many emergencies, both in the air and on the ground. It was Captain James Patterson, a man who had served in the U.S. Air Force before becoming one of Skyline Airways' most trusted pilots. He walked toward Karen, meeting her gaze not with anger nor mockery, but with cold clarity. It was as if all unnecessary emotions had been stripped away, leaving only the essence of the situation. "I am Captain James Patterson," he said firmly. "I've been informed that you requested to speak with me due to a perceived injustice regarding your seating." Karen, regaining some composure upon seeing the uniformed man before her, nodded vigorously. "Yes. I always sit in 1A, always. Those kids are sitting there and refusing to move, even though I've been a Platinum Elite customer for over 10 years. I've lost my seat, been humiliated, and treated like I'm expendable by the crew." James Patterson listened in silence. When she finished, he turned to look at Elijah and Olivia, sitting calmly in their seats, their expressions composed, neither avoiding nor provoking him. The captain turned back, his voice low but resounding in the quiet cabin. "I have received a full report from the airline's operations representative. According to the verified system records, seats on A and 1B were reserved over 2 weeks ago by Mr. Michael Carter, the father of the 2 passengers currently seated there." Karen opened her mouth to interject, but he raised his hand, not hurriedly, but firmly like steel. "I will continue, ma'am." She froze. James Patterson went on. "Being a Platinum Elite member does not give you the right to infringe on the legitimate rights of other passengers. On my flight, disruptive behavior, shouting, delaying departure, or harassing other passengers will be addressed seriously according to aviation safety regulations." He paused, then delivered a statement that ended all arguments. "If you continue to behave as you are, I will have no choice but to request airport security remove you from the flight. Not because of who you are, but because I am responsible for maintaining order and safety for all passengers." Karen opened her mouth as if to argue, but no sound came out. The name James Patterson echoed in her mind. A man who had been featured in articles for his crisis management skills, a man with ultimate authority on this flight. She realized she had reached the limit no one was allowed to cross. From the seats behind, a sparse round of applause began. No one was laughing. No one was mocking. It wasn't gloating. It was a silent acknowledgement that at last order had been restored. Karen, her legs unsteady, was escorted by a new flight attendant to a seat further back. No longer one, no more declarations of privilege. Just another passenger. Nothing more, nothing less. Captain James Patterson gave a brief nod to Elijah and Olivia before returning to the cockpit, saying, "Nothing more." Because to him, the necessary words had already been spoken through action. Karen Mitchell sank heavily into the seat that had been reassigned to her at the back of the first class, the very spot she had always scorned as reserved for second-tier first class. She paused for a moment, but the anger was still rising within her like a flame burning through any remaining semblance of composure. Her eyes reened with fury, her lips pressed tightly as if suppressing a scream, and her hands clutched her expensive Chanel bag so tightly that it seemed as though it might tear apart at any moment. Despite being directly warned by Captain James Patterson, who had full authority over the flight in Karen's mind, that could not be the end. She refused to believe that she, Karen Mitchell, the woman who had been greeted with champagne the moment she stepped onto the plane, was now relegated to the back, treated like an ordinary passenger, and so she could not accept the reality that was unfolding. Minutes passed in silence, but then no one was surprised when Karen suddenly jumped out of her seat. Once again. "No, this can't be happening." Her voice pierced the air, shrill and cutting through the tension in the cabin. A few passengers turned to look, some frowning, others sighing in exasperation. A middle-aged woman nearby muttered to her husband, "Not again. Oh, God." Karen didn't care. She continued to march toward the front of the cabin as though her scream could reverse time itself. "Who do you think you are, making me move to the back? I've flown with Skyline since it was a tiny domestic airline. I've brought this airline reputation and revenue for decades. This Platinum Elite card is not something to be thrown away like a supermarket membership card." She pulled the shiny metal card out of her wallet, holding it up in front of her like undeniable proof of her power. "I'm a VIP customer. I have the right." At the front of the cabin, Richard Bennett and Stephen Coleman stood their ground. Elijah and Olivia remained silent, but their expressions shifted from calm to something resembling observation, cautious, as if they were watching a play where the outcome was already sealed, just waiting for the protagonist to collapse under the weight of her own actions. Richard raised his hand, signaling for the attendant next to him to close the cabin door. A sharp click echoed. Then he turned fully toward Karen, his face as hard as granite, and this time, with no need for lengthy introductions, he spoke directly. "Ms. Karen Mitchell." Karen halted halfway. Something in Richard's voice made her stop, at least for a few seconds. "As the regional director of Skyline Airways, I officially announce your Platinum Elite privileges are permanently revoked. Effective." Immediately his voice rang clear and steady, without a hint of hesitation, like a sentence being delivered without need for further discussion. Karen stood frozen as though she had been frozen in place. In that moment, all the emotions that had been boiling inside her suddenly drained away. She blinked rapidly, her mouth slightly open as if to ask again, but no sound came out. Her eyes moved from Richard to Stephen, then scanned the cabin as if searching for a familiar face to speak in her defense, but all was silent. A young passenger near the aisle quietly pulled out his phone, recording the scene. No one stopped him. Karen didn't seem to notice. She was drowning in the complete collapse of her sense of self. "No, no way," she murmured, stumbling back to her seat, still clutching the card that had now lost all its value. Stephen stepped forward, his voice still calm. Miss Mitchell. Loud behavior, disturbing other passengers, disrupting the departure process, and refusing to comply with the crew and captain's requests are serious violations according to aviation safety regulations. Any passenger, platinum or not, will face the same consequences for such actions. Richard followed up, closing his document. And Skyline does not maintain privileges for anyone who uses them to trample on the dignity of others. Karen stumbled back into her seat as if the strength had drained from her legs. A moment of bitter realization didn't come from sympathy, but from a cold truth. Power, when it no longer has ethics attached to it, is nothing more than a fragile, hollow shell. At the front, Elijah looked over at Olivia. They didn't smile. They didn't clap. They only silently observed the woman, the one who had once shouted at them, telling them they didn't belong, now sitting with her head lowered in the cabin, alone, like a ship lost at sea among the people she had once deemed beneath her. An older man in one of the rear seats leaned toward Elijah and quietly said, "You did the right thing. Not everyone can maintain their dignity in such a situation." Elijah nodded, offering a silent thank you with his eyes. Karen Mitchell no longer shouted, but in the first-class cabin of Flight 473, her silence now rang louder than all the previous tirades. Karen Mitchell sat frozen after hearing the fateful judgment from Richard Bennett. The declaration of her platinum elite privileges being permanently revoked, something she had always viewed as an integral part of her identity. For a brief moment, no one was sure how she would react. But then, as if the last strings of control had snapped, Karen suddenly sprang up once again, this time not in calculated rage, but in the chaos of someone who had just realized that their power had vanished forever. "No, I will not leave. This is my flight." Her scream pierced the air like a knife slashing through the fragile silence of the cabin. She turned around and marched toward Richard as if she could reclaim something, but was immediately stopped by two security officers who stepped forward from the airplane door. The two men, dressed in dark gray uniforms with emotionless expressions, moved with purpose and composure, the posture of those not here to negotiate. One of them, Sergeant Caleb Ortiz, took a half-step forward, his voice firm. "Miss Karen Mitchell, by order of the captain and the executive representatives of Skyline Airways, you have been banned from flying on this flight. We are ordered to escort you off the plane immediately." The entire first-class cabin went silent. Karen spun around, her eyes wide with horror. You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am? I have a lawyer. I'll sue this airline. I'll sue all of you." The captain, the airline. "I will make all of you pay." She wrenched her hand away from the security officer like an animal cornered, her hair disheveled, her breath ragged, still shouting. "I am the one who's been insulted. I'm the one being humiliated. I'll go on TV. I'll call the press. You can't do this to me. You can't." The passengers began to lose patience. An older woman nearby shook her head, sighed. A young man in the middle aisle pulled out his phone and started recording the scene, and a little girl sitting near Elijah curled up against her mother when Karen screamed once more. Captain James Patterson appeared for the second time, his voice no longer carrying a warning. Now it was the undeniable authority of law. "Miss Mitchell, this flight cannot depart while you continue to cause disruption and compromise the safety of the passengers. This is your final warning. If you do not comply, we will be forced to use forceful measures." Karen yanked her handbag away from an attendant who had tried to assist her with her luggage, then screamed, "You will regret this." But no one regretted anything. No one was listening anymore. The two security officers stepped forward, not waiting. Each took one of her arms, gently but firmly. Karen struggled, trying to break free, shouting incoherently, "I am a VIP customer. I am the one who has kept this airline afloat for all these years. You are humiliating me in front of those filthy people." Her eyes scanned the passengers, but all she received was coldness, silence, and disdain. No one supported her. No one stood up. No sympathetic glances. As she passed Elijah and Olivia, her gaze met the two children she had once cursed as undeserving. But both remained seated, calm, as if they knew there was no need to speak. The truth was strong enough to speak for them. Karen screamed one last time, her voice faltering, no longer the heavy threat it once was. "You kids, you'll never understand what real power is." Then the sound of the airplane door closing behind her, a dry, decisive sound like the closing of a chapter. Silence returned. A few passengers began to clap, not to celebrate a victory, but to applaud the return of order, for right to be restored, for a safe space to be properly protected. Captain Patterson nodded briefly to the attendants before returning to the cockpit. The cabin lights shifted to blue. The plane began to taxi down the runway. In seats 1A and 1B, Elijah and Olivia sat upright, their hands intertwined. Olivia gazed out the window, her voice soft yet full of inner strength. "We didn't need to do anything. The world heals itself when someone dares to stand firm with dignity." Elijah simply nodded, his eyes straight ahead, serene. Karen Mitchell had left the plane. But what mattered more than her expulsion was the confirmation that everyone deserves respect, and no one, no matter their title or privilege, has the right to trample on another. When the click of the airplane door closing behind Karen Mitchell echoed through the cabin, a new breeze seemed to enter first class, like fresh air after a storm. The ceiling light softened. The hum of the engines began beneath the floor, and it felt as though every passenger sighed in relief simultaneously. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. The persistent, oppressive tension had finally ended. However, in the front row, Elijah and Olivia Carter showed no signs of gloating or triumph. They didn't laugh, clap, or glare at anyone. They remained seated, upright in seats 1A and 1B, as if they had never left, never been under pressure, never been personally insulted. But their gaze had changed. It was clearer and more resolute than ever before. In that moment, Richard Bennett, the man representing all executive authority of Skyline Airways on this flight, approached the siblings, his face showing the first signs of softness after hours, of maintaining a stern expression. Not weakness, but respect. He bent down, meeting the eyes of the two teenagers, and then spoke gently, not as a director, but as an adult who understood that he needed to say the right thing. "Elijah, Olivia, on behalf of the entire leadership and staff of Skyline Airways, I offer you my sincerest apologies. What you've just gone through in no way reflects the values we have always committed to our customers." No one interrupted. Passengers sitting nearby leaned slightly forward in silence, as though acknowledging that they were witnessing something more important than an apology, the acknowledgement of responsibility. Richard continued, "No one, whether adult or child, regular passenger or member, should ever face discrimination, insult, or favoritism. This not only harmed you, but it also damaged the image and trust customers have placed in our airline for many years. His gaze hardened, but this time with rightful determination. We are committed to ensuring this never happens again. Immediately after landing, I will personally chair an emergency meeting with the entire executive board to review our customer service policies, especially regarding fairness, dignity, and sensitivity when handling situations involving discrimination. The air deepened into another brief pause. Then Olivia Carter lifted her head, her deep brown eyes locking onto Richard's, not with defiance, but with a maturity far beyond her years. Conditional forgiveness. Thank you, sir. And I know you are doing the right thing. But the most important thing is not that we received an apology. The most important thing is that no one else ever has to go through what my brother and I went through today. Her voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of a declaration. No passenger looked away. What had seemed like an unwitting audience in a play had now become witnesses to a lesson that went far beyond a plane ride. Elijah nodded slightly, then added, "Privilege should never allow one to look down on others, and it should never be the reason the crew stays silent when witnessing injustice." Richard listened, then slowly nodded, placing his hand gently on the back of the sibling seats. You two have not only defended your own rights, but you've also made an entire system reflect, and that, to me, is more admirable than any membership card. He stood straight, then turned to the surrounding passengers. We apologize for the delay caused by this disruption, but we also ask for your understanding that those few minutes of delay were in exchange for respect, fairness, and order. These are values that Skyline Airways will no longer compromise on. The cabin fell silent for another moment. Then applause erupted, not in unison, not forced, but in solitary, sincere beats from those who understood. A small incident on an airplane today had changed many things. As Richard left, Olivia gently turned to Elijah. "I think we don't need to do anything big to create change. Just don't back down when treated unfairly." Elijah smiled faintly, then gently squeezed his sister's hand. "Exactly. And always remember, dignity doesn't come from a first-class ticket. It comes from how you stand up when you're disrespected." In the cockpit, the captain's voice came through the intercom. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm James Patterson. The plane is now ready to taxi to the runway. Please fasten your seat belts and thank you for your patience, kindness, and courage during the recent event." The flight was preparing for takeoff, but for Elijah and Olivia, the most important lesson had begun the moment they boarded the plane, and it would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The rumbling sound of the engine began to echo steadily beneath the Boeing 787, like a warm prelude, signaling that the journey was about to take off. On the display screen in the VIP cabin, the words, "Cabin ready for takeoff," appeared in soft blue. The dim lights slowly shifted to warmer tones, easing away the last shadows left by the earlier confrontation. There were no more shouts, no more pressure, no more presence of the shadow called Karen Mitchell. Instead, there was a new atmosphere, light, calm, and strangely warm. The flight attendants, now replaced by a more professional team, moved smoothly between the aisles, adjusting seat belts, collecting forgotten drink cups, and smiling with genuine goodwill. Perhaps they, too, understood that this cabin had just experienced something that no manual could ever teach. Truth, dignity, and courage had been reinstated, not by the crew, but by two 15-year-old teenagers. In the front row, Elijah and Olivia Carter sat still, quietly looking out the window. Outside, the runway stretched ahead, its illuminated lines like a path leading to a new chapter. But inside the plane, it was the atmosphere that was truly shifting. A well-dressed, middle-aged man in seat 1D suddenly turned to them. "Grandson? Granddaughter?" His voice was deep and steady. "I don't know what taught you to stay so calm, but everyone in this cabin sees it and admires it." Olivia looked up a bit surprised. Elijah just smiled politely. "We just tried to do the right thing, sir." The man nodded, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Sometimes doing the right thing in the wrong circumstances is more courageous than 1,000 speeches." From seat 2A, an older woman with glasses holding an open travel book also leaned over, her voice gentle. "I've flown first class for nearly 20 years, and I've never seen two children act like adults the way you two did. When adults stay silent, sometimes it's only the young who dare to stand up." Olivia gently lowered her head, softly, replying, "I think if we stay silent, people like us will keep being overlooked." A small, quiet series of nods followed. Not loud, not forceful, just small acts. One nod, one warm gaze, a light touch on the armrest, but filled with recognition that needed no words. The plane slowly veered onto the main runway. The signal lights flickered. Captain James Patterson's voice came over the intercom, steady as a conductor who had just completed a complicated symphony. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Patterson. We are preparing for takeoff. Please fasten your seat belts and remain in your seats until further notice. Thank you for being part of this flight, and thank you for proving that even when there are storms, kindness and fairness are always the choices we can make." His words made the first-class cabin resonate with a quiet hum, not from the sound, but from the meaning. At that very moment, on the 58th floor of the Global Tech Building in New York, Michael Carter, Elijah, and Olivia's father stood by the office window, phone in hand, eyes fixed on the large screen displaying Flight 473 as it left the runway. The golden light of the afternoon bathed his face, calm, but not without emotion. His phone rang. It was from the Skyline Airways Flight Coordination Center. The call was very brief, just a few words. "Mr. Carter, the flight has taken off safely. The situation has been handled thoroughly. And, sir, your son and daughter have truly impressed us." Michael Carter responded with a single sentence, his voice slow, full of emotion. "I don't want my children to be treated specially. I just want them to be treated fairly like any other child deserves." On the plane, as the wheels lifted from the ground, the entire cabin swayed slightly before settling. The rows of seats seemed to rise just a little, not just in height, but in character. Elijah leaned toward Olivia. "How do you feel?" Olivia didn't look at her brother. She only looked out at the sky, which was slowly shifting from the copper hue of sunset to deep blue, then gently smiled. "I feel free." The flight had taken off, but what truly soared today wasn't just the airplane. It was the courage, dignity, and hope. The sky outside the VIP cabin window of Flight 473 had turned into a deep, tranquil purple. Thin streaks of clouds slowly faded behind the plane's tail as if the past was also gradually disappearing, not forgotten, but fading away. Inside, the murmurs of conversation returned, but this time they carried no suspicion or tension. Instead, there were light, positive conversations and, in a strange way, admiration. Elijah and Olivia Carter remained seated in seats 1A and 1B, no longer surrounded by pressure but by the quiet recognition of those who had witnessed everything. No one cheered loudly. No one hailed them as heroes. But it was the way people chose to speak less and look deeper that showed the important change that had taken place. These two teenagers had made an entire system rethink itself, not with shouts, but with steadfastness. 3 days after the flight landed, a longer-than-usual announcement appeared on the homepage of Skyline Airways. It wasn't in the news section, but was placed at the center, like a declaration. The bold headline read, "A new commitment from Skyline Airways. Justice, equality, and respect are no longer slogans. They are actions." In the body of the message, the airline's media representative officially acknowledged the incident on Flight 473 and announced the launch of a mandatory training program for all staff, from flight attendants to managers, focusing on cultural awareness, discrimination handling, and managing sensitive conflict situations. The establishment of a passenger ethics and human resources department operating independently from the executive system to receive, assess, and handle complaints related to discrimination or unfair treatment, and notably the inclusion of the case of Elijah and Olivia Carter as a case study of courage and dignity in internal training materials across the system. The announcement concluded with a short statement from the CEO of Skyline Airways, a promise made to all passengers, especially those who have ever felt overlooked because of their age, race, or social position. "We do not promise that we will never make mistakes, but we do promise that when we are wrong, we will make it right. And when we see the truth, no matter where it comes from, even from a child, we will stand on the side of what is right." At the Carter family's home in the suburbs of New York, the atmosphere had also calmed after the tumultuous days. Michael Carter put down the phone after finishing another press call. Elijah and Olivia's story had spread across media platforms, not as a scandal, but as an example of the fortitude of two teenagers who refused to succumb to societal pressure. Major newspapers like the New York Times, Washington Post, and even BBC had published commentary with titles like "Two Teenagers" and "The Mid-Air Landing of Justice." When power doesn't come from VIP cards but from truth and courage. The Carter twins and the lesson of respect in an age of privilege. One quiet evening, Elijah and Olivia sat on the porch, the gentle wind rustling the red maple trees coming into season. They still weren't used to receiving interview requests, media inquiries, or having articles written about them. But deep down, they knew that the most important thing wasn't fame. "Do you think we've changed anything?" Olivia asked, her eyes gazing at the starry sky. Elijah thought for a moment, then replied, "At least, we've made an airline change its policies, but more importantly, we didn't let others define our worth by our skin color or age." She smiled lightly. "I think the biggest thing I learned is, if we don't speak up, someone else will continue to stay silent after us." Elijah turned to her, gently holding her hand. "And if anyone asks why we did it, the answer is simple. Because it was the right thing to do, no matter who's sitting across from us." It had gone beyond a plain cabin, beyond an elite service system, and into the hidden corners of society that sometimes chooses to turn a blind eye, discrimination, silence, and the compromise with wrongdoing. With composure, politeness, but unwavering firmness, they had shown that justice doesn't need to scream, dignity doesn't need to be loud, but once it stands firm, it can make the whole world stop and listen. If you were in the first-class cabin that day, which side would you have stood on? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice might inspire someone else. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more powerful, inspiring stories like this. Thank you for following. See you in the next journey.